The state opening of Parliament is an absolute theater of absolute power, tradition, and unspoken hierarchical survival. In this gilded ecosystem, absolutely nothing is ever left to chance or random coincidence. Every single carriage, every planned arrival time, every measured walking order, and every precisely designated seat carries a massive, unyielding message about royal rank, institutional trust, and the ultimate direction of the British monarchy. So when the revised, highly classified procession cards were quietly distributed across the royal household for the ceremony, sharp-eyed courtiers instantly understood the earth-shattering weight of what they were reading. Right there in black and white, Catherine, Princess of Wales, had been positioned directly beside Prince William in the senior formation, the exact prestigious spot that had exclusively belonged to Queen Camilla for years. This was not a minor administrative adjustment or a convenient scheduling update. It was the final, seismic move in a brutal, private war that had been quietly burning behind closed palace doors for months. Long before the public caught a single glimpse of velvet robes and glittering tiaras, the tension had already reached a boiling point. Catherine reportedly placed her hand over William's arm, staring at the document in sheer disbelief, and asked whether King Charles fully understood what the entire country, the press, and the global public would read into such a monumental change. William assured her that his royal father had personally reviewed and approved the amendment, but royal approval and being emotionally or strategically ready for the ferocious public consequences are two completely different realities. In a completely different wing of the palace, Queen Camilla received the exact same updated schedule. She scanned the lines, read Catherine's name printed twice in her former position, and felt her expression tighten into an icy mask as the full, devastating meaning settled over her. With a voice shaking with controlled fury, she demanded to know from her senior aide whether this direct instruction had come straight from the monarch himself. The aide solemnly confirmed that King Charles had signed off on the change after a grueling, late-night review of ceremonial duties, leaving no explanatory notes behind except for 4 cold, administrative words written right beside the amendment: future continuity and active representation. Camilla slowly removed her reading glasses, closed the heavy leather folder with a sharp snap, and whispered in a voice barely audible in the quiet room, "Then everyone will know." The aide remained completely silent because he knew with absolute certainty that the palace press corps and the public would instantly decode the explosive signal before the very first royal carriage even began to roll down the paved driveway. Charles had deliberately refused to frame this dramatic shift as a temporary, sympathetic answer to illness, fatigue, or simple scheduling pressures. A heavily documented internal palace account explicitly described Catherine's new placement as the preferred formation for all future state processions involving Prince William. That single, heavily loaded word, preferred, shattered the old status quo entirely because it permanently suggested absolute permanence. The Prince and Princess of Wales were no longer being positioned as mere supporting figures in the background. They were now being proudly and unapologetically presented to the world as the living, breathing bridge between the current reign and the next. For Catherine, this sudden elevation brought an overwhelming sense of profound responsibility without a single ounce of personal triumph or arrogance. But for Camilla, it felt like her hard-earned recognition was being aggressively withdrawn while she was still actively standing right beside the reigning king. Prince William immediately sensed the brewing danger in the air, acutely aware that while the revised order significantly strengthened his wife's constitutional position, it also violently exposed the widening fracture between competing royal households. Behind that carefully sanitized administrative wording sat a deeply personal, bitter dispute involving all 4 senior royals. A high-stakes confrontation centered entirely on duty, personal loyalty, and who truly held the right to represent the next chapter of the crown. To the casual public watching on television, the majestic procession lasts for only a few fleeting minutes, but for Catherine, Camilla, William, and Charles, those exact minutes carry decades of heavy sacrifice, lingering resentment, and deeply unfinished history. Each of them stepped into that high-pressure ceremony holding something completely different that they desperately needed to protect. One wanted unyielding stability, one desperately demanded hard-fought recognition. One wanted the future fiercely defended, and one aging monarch had to somehow decide which woman the institution could no longer afford to leave at its absolute center. Catherine felt absolutely no victory in the sudden change, fully understanding that her new position would be instantly scrutinized as an aggressive elevation over another senior royal. Yet she also feared that any hesitation would make the monarchy look weak and fragmented at a time when public confidence depends entirely on visible, unbreakable unity. William watched her push her breakfast away untouched the very morning the explosive schedule arrived, softly telling her that she bore no blame for accepting a constitutional duty that his father had formally requested. Catherine replied that while accepting responsibility was relatively easy, carrying the quiet, crushing humiliation of another person was an entirely different burden. He gently reminded her that she had already evolved into one of the monarchy's strongest public anchors, and that undeniable fact mattered immensely because the institution desperately required stability right now, not just after he finally ascended the throne. She looked deeply into his eyes and asked whether institutional strength always had to come at the devastating expense of someone else's emotional well-being. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla was privately wrestling with a completely different kind of existential fear in her private quarters. In a recorded conversation later documented by her sister Annabelle, the Queen Consort openly admitted that she could easily survive the daily venom of newspaper criticism, but she could never stomach being visibly, publicly replaced while her husband was still sitting on the throne. Ceremonial placement had become her ultimate proof that years of relentless loyalty, public endurance, and bitter adaptation had finally been recognized, and losing that prestigious spot felt like the palace was actively rewriting her entire value in the history books. Annabelle desperately tried to offer words of comfort, but Camilla stubbornly refused any solace, noting that Catherine feared deceit might divide the family, while she feared that losing her seat proved the bitter division had already been finalized behind closed doors. That stark contrast cut far deeper than simple anger. One woman saw terrifying danger in gaining a prominent place, while the other saw the ultimate judgment in surrendering it. King Charles was left carrying the crushing weight of both burdens, fully aware that the future of the entire institution increasingly depended on the Prince and Princess of Wales, yet painfully conscious that Camilla had stood loyally beside him through decades of hostility and scandal. Walking past the grand planning room that afternoon, he overheard courtiers speaking both women's names in hushed tones, stopped for one long, agonizing moment in the quiet corridor, and ultimately chose to continue walking without entering. He chose silence because every possible answer felt like an act of betrayal against someone he loved, but silence could never erase history, and the roots of this ceremonial war stretched back much further than anyone dared to admit publicly. The crisis surrounding the royal procession did not suddenly erupt inside the grand halls of Parliament. Its volatile roots were planted months earlier behind the heavy, guarded gates of Windsor Castle during a private diplomatic reception. That evening, a seemingly minor administrative instruction was issued to the royal households just moments before the international guests arrived. To an outside observer, it sounded entirely procedural, a brief adjustment that lasted less than a minute. Yet Prince William heard the alarming undertone instantly. Catherine absorbed the quiet blow with unwavering poise, and King Charles fundamentally failed to reverse it when he had the absolute power to do so. From that precise moment onward, the central question inside the palace was no longer whether the royal family was deeply divided, but rather when that bitter division would finally spill over and become publicly visible to the entire world. Palace planners and senior courtiers had already begun aggressively pressing for sweeping changes behind closed doors. They desperately wanted William and Catherine placed much closer to the sovereign during major state engagements because international diplomats, foreign dignitaries, and global media outlets responded overwhelmingly well to them. Younger generations of audiences followed their every move, and the monarchy as a fragile institution desperately needed a visible, living bridge between the current reign and the next. The Lord Chamberlain, who serves as the senior official responsible for organizing all major royal ceremonies, received these strategic recommendations in writing weeks before the event. But Queen Camilla looked at those exact same proposals and saw something far more dangerous to her own position and status. To the Queen Consort, every single step forward for the Wales family made the reigning king's position look smaller, overshadowed, and prematurely dated. Acting swiftly before the Windsor reception even officially began, she took matters into her own hands and directly instructed the Lord Chamberlain to move Catherine 2 positions farther away from King Charles in the official receiving line. The formal, highly scrutinized row where senior royals stand to greet invited international guests one by one. Her explicit instructions were chillingly precise. The Queen Consort's rightful place must remain visibly and unmistakably closest to the sovereign. That single executive order took only a matter of seconds to issue, but the emotional and political damage it caused lasted far longer than anyone anticipated. Catherine learned of the sudden, humiliating change mere moments before she was scheduled to enter the grand reception room. With remarkable self-control, she smoothly adjusted her white gloves, steadied her breathing, and quietly informed the waiting courtier that she would stand wherever royal duty demanded without complaint. Prince William, however, immediately saw what others completely missed. Although his wife did not utter a single word of protest, a sharp flash of deep hurt crossed her eyes before she expertly masked it behind a royal smile. He carried that painful image with him through the entire evening, letting the resentment fester until the final guest had finally departed the castle rooms. Seeking an immediate confrontation, William cornered King Charles after the last visitor left, demanding to know why his wife had been deliberately moved down the receiving line without any prior consultation or professional courtesy. The king desperately tried to avoid the core of the question, issuing a stern warning that ceremonial order and royal protocol must never be allowed to devolve into a petty family argument. William fired back with devastating clarity, shouting that it had already become a family argument the exact moment Catherine was treated as a threatening rival instead of the undisputed future queen. With that, the prince abruptly set down his crystal glass on a nearby table and walked out of the room before dessert could even be served, permanently altering the internal power dynamics of the palace. Following that explosive confrontation, a confidential internal planning memorandum, essentially a binding operational document used to guide future royal decisions, was hurriedly drafted by senior advisors. It explicitly demanded clear, uninterrupted generational continuity at all future state ceremonies and strictly blocked any last-minute, unauthorized changes initiated by separate royal households. When Camilla later read a documented account revealing that the Windsor reception had been officially cited as dangerous and damaging interference, she felt intensely exposed, as though she were being politically cornered rather than merely opposed. That bitter memory roared back to life when the preparations for the state opening of Parliament finally reached their critical, final stage. Furious at the new layout, Camilla demanded that King Charles completely reject the panel's recommendations, leading to a tense, high-stakes summons where Prince William was dragged in to face her unprecedented challenge face-to-face. What followed next was not a polite discussion between distant royal households, but a ferocious, closed-door confrontation where every single restrained grievance, past insult, and hidden frustration finally flooded into the room all at once. There were no cameras, no protective advisors, and no carefully prepared public statements to soften the blow when all four of them met behind closed oak doors. King Charles sat silently at the head of the heavy mahogany table, looking like a man trapped between two entirely different worlds. Camilla arrived carrying the newly revised procession schedule in her hand, walking with stiff, defensive posture. William entered the room with heavy steps, refusing to even remove his long wool coat, radiating palpable anger. Catherine came in last, quietly closing the heavy oak door behind her with a soft click that sounded like a prison lock. For several agonizing seconds, absolute silence hung heavy in the room, until the Queen Consort aggressively slammed the procession car down onto the table right in front of the king and uttered the exact sentence that shattered every remaining pretense of family unity. Leaning menacingly forward toward Charles, Camilla declared with absolute finality, "That place is mine," insisting that removing her from the central formation while she still proudly held the title of Queen Consort actively crippled the constitutional authority and public respect of his reign. She argued fiercely that the title represented the sovereign's wife, a role lacking constitutional lawmaking power, but carrying enormous, irreplaceable public weight across the Commonwealth. She passionately argued that millions of television viewers and newspaper readers would interpret the sudden change not as a harmless logistical adjustment, but as a public rejection and demotion. The king listened to her passionate outburst with a heavy heart, but his cowardly silence only served to sharpen her blinding anger into pure resentment. Before his father could fumble for a diplomatic response, Prince William stepped forward and answered for him, stating with cold, unyielding resolve that the state opening of Parliament could never be arranged around the fragile task of protecting personal pride. Parliament desperately needed to see strong, visible generational continuity standing directly beside the sovereign, and Catherine had already been formally asked by the institution to carry a much wider, more demanding constitutional role. He stressed that this critical role involved active public duties supporting the core of the crown and vigorously preparing the nation for the next reign, insisting that she could no longer be treated as a mere decorative figurehead when the entire institution increasingly depended on her daily steadiness. Catherine remained remarkably quiet throughout the shouting match until Camilla directly accused the Wales household of aggressively lobbying and scheming behind the scenes to engineer the entire change. Lifting her eyes with calm dignity, the princess softly stated that she had neither requested the coveted seat nor ever intended to use it as a weapon against anyone in the family. Unimpressed by the denial, the queen consort snapped back that actively accepting the seat was still a deliberate, conscious choice. Catherine's expression instantly hardened. Refusing a direct constitutional duty requested by King Charles would also be a choice, she pointed out, and the catastrophic consequences of that refusal would inevitably fall squarely on William, the monarchy, and every single future appearance they were forced to make together. Recognizing that the argument was spinning dangerously out of control, King Charles finally raised his hand to restore order, gently reminding them all that the historic procession existed solely to serve Parliament and the nation, not to display a petty family war to the public. William immediately challenged him on the hypocrisy, cutting straight to the point. If the symbolic placement truly did not matter at all, why had his father personally signed and approved the new order in the first place? Trapped by his own signature, the monarch reluctantly admitted that he had signed the document because drastically reduced engagements, advancing age, and mounting public concern had made future continuity completely impossible to hide any longer. The country desperately needed to see with its own eyes who was capable of carrying the heavy weight of the crown next. Camilla slowly turned her tear-filled eyes toward her husband, asking the most devastating question of all. Had Catherine truly become so much more politically necessary to him than she was? Charles offered no answer, and that deafening silence struck the room far harder than any verbal confession ever could have. With a sharp gasp of disbelief, Camilla violently pushed her heavy chair backward, stood up abruptly, and walked out of the room, leaving the incriminating planning card behind on the table. Catherine stared down at the handwritten royal approval resting right beside her printed name, knowing with a sinking heart that the decision carried another layer of institutional protection that Charles had never consciously designed. Camilla firmly believed that the king's signature had unfairly stolen her rightful place away from her. But the deeper, more unsettling truth was that the unfeeling machinery of the British monarchy had already marched far beyond the control or power of any single wounded conversation. The ultimate, explosive culmination of the ceremonial crisis did not arrive through a formal, sanitized press release or a leaked palace memo. It unfolded in agonizing real time under the watchful eyes of millions as the sun rose over London on the morning of the state opening of Parliament. By early dawn, massive, eager crowds of royal supporters and international tourists had already packed tightly behind the heavy steel barriers erected near Buckingham Palace and all along the grand procession route. They had arrived hours early expecting traditional, untroubled pageantry, but what they ultimately witnessed before their eyes was a profound, irreversible institutional transition. When Catherine finally appeared in the central formation directly beside Prince William, a palpable wave of absolute shock rippled instantly through the dense crowd like a sudden electrical current. Smartphones shot upward into the air. Seasoned royal commentators abruptly stopped speaking mid-sentence for a fraction of a second too long. And in that heavy, breathless silence, millions of television viewers across the globe instantly understood that the British monarchy had just exposed its undeniable future without issuing a single word of direct explanation. Catherine maintained a mask of absolute, unyielding composure as the royal procession officially began to move forward. The princess firmly occupied the prestigious place beside William, while Queen Camilla traveled in a separate carriage alongside King Charles under the heavily revised arrangement. This delicate compromise ensured that formal legal precedence still rightfully belonged to the king and queen consort inside Parliament, which was crucial because the high-stakes ceremony needed to visibly recognize the approaching future without completely stripping away the dignity of the present. It also mattered immensely because one single misplaced step or arrogant expression could easily detonate a carefully managed transition into an outright public humiliation. Just before the carriages began to roll, Prince William turned toward Catherine and offered a solemn, reassuring nod. Not a gesture of arrogant celebration, but a silent acknowledgement of the crushing weight she was carrying on her shoulders. She understood the immense gravity of the moment immediately. Meanwhile, Camilla remained composed beside Charles. Yet the queen consort watched every movement with hawk-like intensity as they approached the grand parliamentary entrance. True to her word and deeply aware of the psychological delicacy required, Catherine deliberately slowed her pace just enough, stepping slightly backward to allow the reigning monarch and his wife to enter the building well ahead of the Wales family. The public reaction to this masterclass in grace was instantaneous and electric. By afternoon, the Daily Chronicle published a sensational front-page spread featuring a striking photograph of Catherine walking beside William beneath bold, commanding headlines that read, "The future takes its place." During the live BBC ceremonial broadcast, a veteran commentator praised the move as the clearest and most definitive institutional recognition, yet that the Wales family now firmly carries the next chapter of the crown, while also respectfully noting Camilla's dignified, unyielding entrance beside the sovereign. Outside Buckingham Palace, an elderly woman proudly holding an archival photograph of the late Queen Elizabeth II was interviewed by reporters, stating simply that she fully understood the immense historical weight of that seat. The surrounding crowd broke into supportive applause, drowning out the lingering whispers of dissent. Although early online debates had viciously centered on the false narrative of Camilla being discarded, the powerful visual of Catherine gracefully pausing completely transformed the narrative overnight. What initially looked like a bitter defeat was successfully reframed as a civilized, managed transition, and what could have easily been perceived as a cruel institutional push-out was instead turned into a masterclass of controlled diplomacy. King Charles watched the recorded replay of the procession that single evening, carefully studying Catherine's deliberate step backward and Camilla's steady forward movement, and finally grasped the full, brilliant meaning of the gesture. Turning to his loyal private secretary, the king quietly admitted, "She protected all of us." Behind the heavy, oak-paneled gates of the palace, weary aides immediately stopped referring to the complex arrangement as a fragile compromise, choosing instead to call it what it truly was, a permanent settlement. Prince William had successfully gained the crucial institutional recognition he demanded. Catherine had flawlessly demonstrated unmatched personal restraint. Queen Camilla had successfully retained her essential precedence, and King Charles had miraculously avoided a catastrophic public fracture. Yet, one final, unavoidable judgment still remained to be settled. While the entire nation had already reached its own conclusion, the deepest, most intimate verdict had to be delivered inside the private rooms of the palace, where Charles finally had to articulate what Catherine's historic placement in the procession had truly represented all along. Later that evening, the discarded procession cards were quietly collected, the heavy ceremonial uniforms were unbuttoned and stored away, and the grand palace corridors grew peaceful and quiet once more. Yet, not a single person inside the royal household believed for a second that this monumental day could simply be filed away as just another routine state opening. Catherine had indeed taken Camilla's former seat, but she had steadfastly refused to turn the historic moment into an act of petty revenge or triumphalism. The brutal change had exposed a raw, painful truth, brutally tested a royal marriage, severely challenged a future king, and forced the ancient monarchy to finally decide whether future continuity could ever be formally acknowledged without inflicting deliberate cruelty upon the present. Seeking closure, King Charles gathered William, Catherine, and Camilla together in the exact same private room where the fierce confrontation had originally begun days earlier. The heavily revised procession card rested quietly at the exact center of the mahogany table, but in a striking display of mutual respect, nobody reached out to touch it. The king spoke softly, explaining to the room that the controversial placement had never once been designed to diminish or remove his wife from the reigning core of the monarchy. Rather, it was a necessary recognition that the Prince and Princess of Wales now carried inescapable, massive responsibilities that could no longer remain hidden in the shadows until the next official accession. Turning his gaze directly toward Camilla, he openly admitted that his cowardly silence during their earlier confrontation had caused far more emotional pain than the administrative schedule itself, acknowledging that allowing ceremonial uncertainty to morph into personal conflict was a grave leadership failure. His wife listened to his vulnerable confession without a single interruption. When he finally finished speaking, the queen consort quietly accepted that the unstoppable march of the future could no longer be artificially delayed merely to protect her personal position, though she formally requested one strict condition: that all future institutional changes be discussed with complete honesty rather than delivered as finalized, unalterable executive decisions. Catherine responded immediately, promising that while she would faithfully accept every demanding duty required of her by the crown, she would never willingly participate in creating public humiliation for another family member. Prince William looked at her with an expression of profound, unspoken pride, fully understanding that she had successfully secured true institutional authority through unmatched personal restraint rather than aggressive triumph. King Charles firmly confirmed that the new procession formation would henceforth remain the preferred, standard arrangement for all future state openings involving the Waleses. The decision was officially final, no longer a temporary exception, a risky experiment, or a hidden gamble. Camilla slowly reached across the table, picked up the card, studied Catherine's printed name for a long moment, and laid it back down without a trace of lingering anger. "Then carry it well," she whispered softly. The princess looked her in the eye and answered with unwavering resolve, "I will carry it carefully." The final verdict was now unmistakably clear to everyone in the room. Catherine had not taken the coveted seat because Camilla had somehow become worthless or obsolete. She had taken it because the survival of the British monarchy could no longer afford to remain even one step behind its present reality. King Charles remains the sovereign, and his wife remains proudly beside him, but William and Catherine are now universally recognized as the vital pair who must sustain everything that comes next. Catherine entered that historic procession as the woman simply taking another seat, but she left it as something infinitely more consequential: the recognized, steadfast guardian of the monarchy's next chapter.